As daylight broke on the teepees of Black Kettle's village on the morning of the 29th of November, 1864, the people went about their routines unaware of the hell they were about to endure. As the morning progressed, the people noticed the movements of soldiers toward the village. Black Kettle told the people not to fear. They were here to escort them back to Fort Lyon for peace talks. Black Kettle hung an American flag and a white flag of truce on his lodge. He had placed trust in the white soldiers, a trust that was misplaced. Soldiers opened fire on the village, killing indiscriminately. Men, women, children, infants, elderly, it didn't matter. Soldiers were not selective in their targets. As the Cheyennes began to flee to the north, they were run down by the soldiers. As many as 137 people were killed, less than 30 warriors. The Sand Creek Massacre would be the spark that would ignite fierce warfare in the northern plains. Join us in our second episode of Red Cloud's War, the Indian War of 1865.
Well, every road I see leads away from me.
You're listening to the Tales of the Trails podcast, produced by Duke Fraser Productions in association with the 11 Bang Bang YouTube channel. I'm your host, Duke Fraser.
Saying, friend, come see what's round the bend. So is it any wonder that I roam?
Before the massacre at Sand Creek, the Southern Cheyenne had been divided between chiefs that wished to seek peace and those who wished to fight for their lands. The most prominent of the peace chiefs was Black Kettle. After the massacre, even Black Kettle reluctantly agreed that retribution was needed. The Cheyenne sent out runners to ask other tribes for help. The Arapaho and Lakota agreed to join the fight. As 1864 drew to a close, 1865 would prove to be a long and bloody year with fighting in the east and the west. Two of the warriors that would join the Dog Soldiers were George and Charlie Bent. They were the sons of William Bent, a prominent trader who had established a trading post on the Arkansas River in 1833 to trade with the Southern Cheyenne. In 1835, he would marry Owl Woman, and she would bear 3 boys as well as a daughter. Robert Bent, the eldest, had taken part in his father's trading business and had no interest in fighting in the Civil War. George would join the Confederacy with the Missouri State Guard and serve as an artilleryman. Charlie was too young to join the fight. Brother Charlie and sister Julia would remain with their Cheyenne family. George was captured very early in the war, and with help of his father's influence was paroled to his brother Robert's custody. George would join Charlie and Julia with the Cheyenne. The Bent children would survive the attack on Sand Creek, though George was seriously wounded. As a general war on the whites was agreed upon, the alliance would turn its attention to the north. The town of Julesburg on the northern edge of the Colorado Territory had been established in the 1850s and served as a stage line for Ben Holliday's overland stage. By 1864, it had become a respectable town. About a mile from Julesburg on the south side of the South Platte River, the military established Camp Rankin, a small one-company post that would be home to Company F of the 7th Iowa Cavalry. They would arrive in September of 1864, and for the most part would enjoy a quiet post with little activity. On the 7th of January 1865, the peaceful little post would see its first action. The Avengers of Sand Creek would arrive just a few miles away from Julesburg on the night of January 6th. Taking care to ensure their presence was not known, several guards were placed around the camp to keep the eager young warriors from prematurely attacking. Before the sun rose on the morning of the 7th, the warriors began making preparations for the battle to come. The warriors knew they could not penetrate the defenses of Camp Rankin without sustaining heavy losses. They planned to draw the soldiers out of the fortifications and surround them in open ground. Big Crow, a chief of the Crooked Lance Society, would lead the decoys consisting of 5 other Cheyenne warriors and 2 Lakota. As the warriors approached the fortification, they noticed several men outside of the structure and attacked. Within a few minutes, Captain Nicholas J. O'Brien led a group of 37 soldiers out of Camp Rankin in pursuit of the decoys. An overwhelming victory for the natives was nearly in hand. However, a few young and overly eager warriors charged too early, and O'Brien realized the danger he was in. He immediately halted his men and ordered the bugler to sound retreat. Though they were only 300 yards from Camp Rankin, the soldiers had a long and desperate fight back. They became surrounded multiple times, and at one point, Private James Cannon used his rifle as a club to dismount a pursuing warrior. By the time Captain O'Brien reached the fortifications, 14 of his men would be killed. Upon re-entering Camp Rankin, Captain O'Brien dismounted and took command of one of the new Parrott guns. O'Brien had had 3 years' experience with artillery, and he put the experience to good use. Ordering the cannoneers to load reduced charges, he gave the warriors a false sense of security in the range of the gun. Once a group of warriors moved within easy range, O'Brien ordered a full charge be loaded, and the round resulted in several warriors killed. This essentially brought an end to the attack on the soldiers. The warriors turned their attention to the town of Julesburg, taking anything they could carry. The store, ran by Green Thompson, was stripped bare, and later the government would pay his widow $20,000 for the captured goods. At the boarding house, George Bent found the morning breakfast still warm on the table. The warriors helped themselves before they continued pillaging the town. As they rummaged through the mail bags at the stage station, the Bents found a new major's uniform, which they took. By late afternoon, satisfied with their plunder, the warriors began moving back toward their camp. The attack on Julesburg was over. In addition to the 14 soldiers killed in the morning, 5 civilians would also die in the attack. Julesburg was not the only action to take place on the 7th of January. Halfway to Valley Station, a wagon load of passengers from American Ranch was attacked by a force of an estimated 40 to 70 warriors. The warriors succeeded in killing the horses, bringing the wagon to a halt. The passengers and driver managed to escape to the nearby riverbank, but 3 would be killed. 2 of the dead were recently discharged soldiers. While searching the bodies, the warriors found 2 scalps and instantly recognized them as belonging to White Leaf and Little Wolf, both killed at Sand Creek. The warriors, enraged, horribly mutilated the bodies of the 2 soldiers, enacting the first certain revenge for Sand Creek. Immediately after Julesburg, General Robert Mitchell would organize large forces for a campaign against the natives in the South Platte Valley. Mitchell would gather 640 cavalry with a complement of 4 12-pound mountain howitzers and 2 3-inch Parrott guns. The men would spend 12 days in the field searching for the natives. A small group of Cheyenne and Lakota warriors ran through the scouting party camp one night, neither side taking casualties. On the 19th of January, the force found the remnants of a large village on the Republican, but it had been abandoned for several days. At the end of the campaign, Mitchell would sustained around 50 casualties. These men had not been wounded in combat, it was the weather. During one night of the campaign, the temperature would drop to 22 degrees below zero. Mitchell himself would also suffer, having frozen a toe. While Mitchell had been unsuccessful in his search for the natives, it became apparent that they had moved toward the North Platte River. At Camp Cottonwood, Mitchell would be informed of multiple attacks on stage stations between Julesburg and Valley Station. Beaver Creek Station, Godfrey's Ranch, Morrison's American Ranch, Gittrell's Ranch, Valley Station, and several others would be attacked, most of them burned. Mitchell attempted a new tactic to stop the raids. He sent out orders to all posts for soldiers to set fires to the prairie. A line of fire running 300 miles in length was set, burning its way south, reaching the Arkansas River 3 days later. Fire would reach the Texas Panhandle. Mitchell would succeed in depriving the natives of forage in this area, but its overall effectiveness was minimal. On the 2nd of February, the natives would again attack Julesburg. The force at Camp Rankin had been reduced to 15 men. Captain O'Brien, who had been part of Mitchell's group, was en route back to Camp Rankin. At Dick Cleave's ranch, O'Brien discovered the men preparing for a fight as a group of warriors were rounding up the stock on the opposite side of the river. As O'Brien pushed on, reaching the top of Devil's Dive, he could see warriors surrounding Camp Rankin and Julesburg burning. O'Brien decided to make a run for the camp. The 15 soldiers inside the fortifications were successfully holding back the warriors with cannon fire. However, they could not drive them from the field. As O'Brien approached, he ordered his howitzer discharged. As a temporary gap opened, O'Brien made his run. While the warriors attempted to cut O'Brien off, crossfire from his and the camp's howitzers kept the way open. O'Brien successfully entered the fortifications, and all rejoiced. As the warriors continued to circle the fortifications, by evening it was over. Julesburg was smoldering ruins. After the second attack on Julesburg, the Native Alliance decided to move north to the Powder River country. On the 3rd of February, they burned the telegraph station at Lodgepole Creek. The following day, they would arrive at Mud Spring Station. Running off the stock, the warriors began their siege of the station. On the afternoon of the 4th, Colonel William O. Collins, who was the district commander, received word of the attack at his headquarters at Fort Laramie. He sent an immediate dispatch to Fort Mitchell, ordering a relief party. At 7 p.m., Collins himself would take to the field, leading 120 soldiers made up of men from the 7th Iowa and 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry units. They would reach Fort Mitchell the next day, and after a short rest, resume their march again at 7 p.m. The detachment of the 11th Ohio sent from Fort Mitchell under Lieutenant William Ellsworth reached Mud Springs on the morning of the 5th. Collins' command would arrive on the morning of the 6th. Collins stated that the warriors numbered from 500 to 1,000 and were armed with rifles, pistols, and bows. After Collins' arrival, he wired Fort Laramie to send a howitzer, and the fight would continue for another 4 hours. Finally, the soldiers began to push the warriors back, and soon the warriors left the field. Lieutenant William Brown, with an additional 50 men of the 11th Ohio, arrived with the 12-pound mountain howitzer, 34 hours after Collins had sent word. The soldiers began repairing the telegraph line to Fort Laramie under the cover of darkness with aid of the cannon. On the 7th of February, Collins went on the offensive, sending out scouting parties to find the native village. It became apparent that they were in the vicinity of Rush Creek. Collins formed his command of 185 men into 4 squadrons. At Rock Creek Springs, scouts found the remnants of a camp. Strewn upon the ground were empty food cans and the carcasses of 100 cattle that had been slaughtered. As the soldiers reached the mouth of Rush Creek on the 8th, they found warriors grazing stock on the north bank of the Platte. Soon, an estimated 2,000 warriors lined the hills. The warriors charged the soldiers, attempting to surround them on all sides. Canister shot from howitzers slowed the charge, but the warriors quickly regrouped. The soldiers began digging defensive works, and by the time the warriors were upon them, they had made a respectable breastwork. Many warriors would be wounded or killed in the ensuing fight, and 2 soldiers were killed and 15 wounded. 2 more would die later from their wounds. By the morning of the 9th, the Battle of Rush Springs was over. Collins decided not to pursue, stating it would be injudicious and useless. He would leave the field on the afternoon of the 10th and return to Fort Laramie on the 14th. The Native Alliance continued to attack and harass small stations through March and into April. On the 22nd of April, Lieutenant Colonel William Balmer received word from General Connor to hang Big Crow, the Cheyenne that had led the decoys in the attack on Julesburg, after he had been discovered with the scalp of a white woman tied to his belt. After turning to Fort Laramie on the 14th of February, soldiers of the 11th Ohio had attempted to lynch Big Crow, but Colonel Collins had stopped the attempt. General Connor had ordered the hanging in retaliation for a soldier that had been killed several miles west of Fort Laramie. The event was brutal. A chain was placed around Big Crow's neck, and the ball and chain he had worn in the guardhouse at Fort Laramie remained on his leg. Connor had ordered that the body be left suspended after the hanging. On the 3rd of May, Colonel Thomas Moonlight led a force of 500 cavalry west from Fort Laramie in an attempt to find a Cheyenne camp believed to be camped near the Wind River. They would arrive on the 12th of May, but Fane Mountain men Jim Bridger, who had been hired as a scout for the expedition, could find no sign of the encampment. Moonlight would return to Fort Laramie having nothing to show. Cheyenne and Lakota warriors followed behind Moonlight's return, attacking stations along the progression. Moonlight arrived at Fort Laramie on the 23rd of May. On the 26th, he ordered Two-Face and Blackfoot, members of the Oglala tribe of the Lakota, to be hanged. Two-Face had been captured on the 15th of May. Among his band was Mrs. Lucinda Eubank. She had been captured by the Cheyenne in August of 1864. Two-Face had purchased Mrs. Eubank from a Cheyenne. On the 24th of May, soldiers captured Blackfoot from an information provided by Mrs. Eubank. Moonlight decided from informants that Blackfoot was involved at Mud Springs battle and that Two-Face had been involved in the capture of Mrs. Eubank. At 1:30 on the 26th of May, the two men were taken to a new scaffold built next to the one that still held the body of Big Crow and were hung by chains. As May turned into June, the Army made little progress. Warriors continued to attack and harass stations all along the Oregon Trail. While the Army struggled with the defenses of ranches, stations, and telegraph line along the trail, command turned their attention toward friendly natives that did not wish to participate in the fight. Referred to as the Laramie Loafers, approximately 1,500 Lakota of the Brule and Oglalas lived next to or in the vicinity of Fort Laramie. In the early part of June, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton ordered the peaceful natives to be relocated to Fort Kearny in Nebraska. An escort of 135 7th Iowa Cavalry soldiers under the command of Captain William Fouts joined the natives as they began their trek east. When the group arrived at Horse Creek, some 40 miles east of Fort Laramie, the natives held a secret council. They did not wish to live at Fort Kearny, which was near their enemies, the Pawnee. As the soldiers began marching the next morning, the natives did not immediately follow. As Fouts investigated the issue, he found the natives in a quarrel between those that did not wish to escape and those that wanted to return north to the Black Hills. When the march had begun, Fouts had allowed the natives to keep their weapons. It was a mistake that would cost him his life. As the quarrel progressed, White Thunder, a chief of the Brule, fired his weapon at Fouts, hitting him in the head and chest, killing him instantly. Standing Elk and several other chiefs who wished to sue for peace were also killed. As the 7th Iowa came to the rescue of their captain, the natives made a fierce charge that forced the soldiers to take positions among the wagons. Lieutenant John Wilcox quickly discovered that Captain Fouts had also denied the rearguard cartridges as to prevent incident during the escort. By the time Wilcox organized his troops, the natives were crossing the North Platte River. A skirmish ensued. 30 natives were killed crossing the river. Wilcox ordered the men not to pursue the natives across the river. Instead, they returned to find Fouts' body, which had been mutilated with a pickaxe. 4 troopers had been killed and 4 others wounded. Lieutenant Wilcox gathered the men, along with the whites with native families, and all returned to Fort Laramie. On the 14th of June, Colonel Moonlight learned of the events at Horse Creek. Determined to recapture the natives, he gathered a force of 234 men of mixed California, Ohio, and Kansas cavalry units and pursued them across the North Platte. 3 days later, at Dead Man's Fork of Hat Creek, 200 warriors charged on Moonlight's men. Moonlight had ordered the men to dismount and unsaddle their horses to rest. The warriors stampeded through the column, stealing all the horses. Moonlight was forced to return to Fort Laramie on foot. When General Connor learned of Moonlight's embarrassment, he acted quickly and on the 20th of June wrote to General Dodge that Moonlight had been relieved of command. General Connor would move his headquarters to Fort Laramie so that he could prepare a large-scale offensive operation. While he began organization, officials in Washington announced their desires to seek peace. The Civil War having come to a close, the country was in economic turmoil, and it could not afford to fight a war in the West. Despite this, Connor would organize a force of 2,500 men divided into 3 commands. They would be led by Connor, Colonel Samuel Walker, and Colonel Nelson Cole. As Connor was making the final preparations for his campaign toward the end of July, the Native Alliance made a large attack at Platte Bridge Station. Old Man afraid of his horses, Young Man afraid of his horses, and Red Cloud led the Lakota. Dull Knife, White Bull, and Roman Nose led the Cheyenne. As they had done before, the natives attempted to decoy the soldiers from the post, leading them to an ambush. On July 25th, soldiers at Platte Bridge Station noticed approximately 20 warriors on the hills north of the river. A detachment of 11th Kansas Cavalry crossed the river to drive them off. When the pursuers had chased the warriors 3 miles from the bridge, it became apparent that they were riding into an ambush. About the same time, they received orders to return to the station. Another large body of warriors had been spotted on the south side of the river to the east. The men turned their mounts and fell back, and all returned. Around 4 p.m., a mail ambulance arrived with Lieutenant Casper Collins. Lieutenant Collins was the son of William O. Collins, commander at Fort Laramie. A detachment of 30 men under Captain Greer arrived shortly thereafter. The soldiers managed to drive the attackers back for the evening. During an inspection of arms, it was found that there were less than 20 shots per man among the soldiers. A 12-pound mountain howitzer had 48 rounds. As the sun rose on the morning of the 26th, a 10-man detachment arrived at the station. They informed Major Anderson that Sergeant Amos Custard was heading for the post with a wagon train and asked permission to go escort him in. Major Anderson felt it was unnecessary. The force at the post now consisted of 87 men of the 11th Kansas Cavalry, 14 of the 3rd U.S. Infantry, and 14 of the 11th Ohio Cavalry. In total, there were 7 officers and 113 troopers. Lieutenant Henry Brentley again offered to go and retrieve Sergeant Custard with 75 men and a howitzer. Major Anderson again said no, but agreed to send 20 men. There were no volunteers. Finally, Lieutenant Collins volunteered to go if given more men. At 7:30 a.m., Collins left the post with a detachment of 25 men. When Collins had proceeded half a mile from the bridge, he spotted 2 warriors attempting to cut the telegraph wires. He ordered an immediate charge. 400 dog soldiers descended on Collins and his men. Realizing his dire situation, Collins turned back, his only hope being to reach the bridge. The ensuing fight was fierce. Many of the warriors, being in such great number, had chosen not to use firearms so as to not to hit their own. Spears, clubs, tomahawks, and sabers are what they carried into this fight. This likely saved Collins' command from being wiped out. Despite the limited use of guns, Collins would suffer a bullet to the hip. As the soldiers made their run, one of them had their horse shot from underneath them. Collins turned to help this soldier. It would be his last action. An arrow would embed itself in Collins' forehead, killing the young lieutenant. All but 4 of Collins' detachment made it safely back to the bridge. The main battle was over, lasting less than an hour. The Cheyenne and Lakota continued to try and lure the soldiers into a trap for another hour, but the soldiers refused to leave the station. The warriors gave up trying to lure the soldiers out, and instead turned their attention to Sergeant Custard's wagon train. Next time on Tales of the Trails, Sergeant Amos Custard's wagon train is attacked by Cheyenne and Lakota warriors immediately after the fight at Platte Bridge Station. General Connor takes to the field to bring an end to the conflict. The Indian War of 1865 continues.
All the places I have been.
Tales of the Trails is produced by Duke Frazier Productions. Music performed by Garrett Woods from the 11 Bang Bang YouTube channel. Sources for this episode may be found in the description field below. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button and be sure to subscribe. Click the bell to receive notification of new episodes. Until next time, keep your powder dry.
Calls me as it goes.